Hi there, I'm Chris Krycho, and today I'm going to talk to you about the process of writing and recording Fanfare for a new era of American spaceflight, which I started in 2020, put into the world in a mock-up form, I think in 2021, and then in 2022 recorded with the Budapest Scoring Orchestra. This was not a thing I had done. When I set out, it wasn't a thing I was planning to do. And finally put into the world that recording in 2023, and now I'm talking about it in 2024. So this is a 4-year-long process, but a really good one. So let's get into it. 4 years ago, I sat down at my keyboard on a week off and thought, I would like to write some music. What do I want to write? And I'm flipping back here through to my notes, and here it is. Sketch of something space-ish. Crew Dragon? Artemis? I didn't know what I was going to write, but I had a week off, and it had been a long time since I was composing. I did a lot during college, but not a lot since then. And I thought, I can write a fanfare. Fanfare seems good. And I thought about it a little more, and I thought, SpaceX is going to launch the Crew Dragon demo in a few weeks if everything goes according to plan. And it didn't quite, but it still launched after a few weeks. Maybe I could write a fanfare for that. I've got a week. How much can I do? So what I thought I would do today is the first part in what I expect will be a 3-ish part, probably, series on how this worked. What did the process actually look like? A few years ago, I wrote up a blog post series about this sort of thing and tried to give a little bit of the experience, a little bit of the background. What does it mean to go ahead and try to go from nothing to putting a piece of music out in the world and then actually, sharing that with people and being able to say, not just here's some music that I use some samples with, but here's an orchestra playing it. And along the way, I learned a lot of things about Logic and about Dorico and about samples and about hiring orchestras. So we'll talk through some of all of those. I want to start today by giving you a little sample first of what it started like and what it finished like. So here's a little bit of early, just kind of sitting at my piano, playing things and recording them. What did that sound like? It sounded like this. Now, cool. What did it sound like by the time an orchestra played it? Oh, now that's very, very different in a lot of ways. One of them, obviously, is that it was recorded nicely and has good audio and great, presence in the room, and it's the actual instruments. It's not just a piano. It's an opening with a trumpet and then the whole orchestra going. But there's also a lot of differences between the actual musical content. The thing I started with is obviously very much there to some extent in the thing I ended with, but there's been development of those ideas, and this is very common. Let's dig in a little bit on, well, the sketch. Okay, so at this point, I want to talk through a couple things that happened here. And this is triplets in F. That's the key idea. That is not the sound that you end up with in the final piece. Because no triplets. That's very Star Trek. It's a little bit Next Generation. It's a little bit of the original, but especially the Goldsmith scores for the movies and the Next Generation score. I can't even remember that one because I'm getting stuck on my fanfare. But the more I listened to it, the more I thought, this is just too much Star Trek, even for a SpaceX launch. So, as we'll see next time, when I sat down at Dorico and started working in it, that is not what I kept. But that idea, that rising and then coming down idea, ended up being a key theme. That kind of thing was going to show up. Not in the end what made the piece, but an important part of it. Then I started sketching around with what actually would become a really key part of it, and I have this written down here as octaves. Oh, now that's starting to sound familiar. And originally it was an eighth note followed by a tied eighth note to a dotted half note. So these rhythms are also not the same as I was going to end up with later. But the sound is starting to get there. And then I do some things that I didn't do later. Yeah. Dum-dum. A lot of these harmonies in particular, some of the melodic motion here ended up very directly in there, but not the harmonic work at all. And that ended up being a really important decision. One of the things I figured out working on this in particular, which I knew back in college, is that what happens on a piano and what happens when you orchestrate that for an orchestra, it's not the same. I had bass sitting under that. But not very interesting, to be perfectly honest. And you can hear it's just kind of sitting there in this little meandery way. And it's fine, but it's not great yet. It needed development. And so I've got a lot of things like can go to an F major 5, and okay, this is an E flat 5, an A flat 5, an E flat 3, D flat 3. And again, a lot of good ideas, but nothing that stuck. And that first afternoon actually, and this was a really formative experience for me. The first afternoon was just full of these sketches. I've got more here. None of it was quite working. And I was actually really discouraged at that point. I was thinking, am I going to be able to get anywhere? I have a week. I've spent the first day of it doing this. I spent part of the morning wrangling my kids because I was off and my kids were off. It was summertime and, they're kids. And so I was hitting the end of the day very unsure that I was going to get anywhere. And I went to bed feeling like that, honestly. And I got up the next day, so Tuesday of the week, and I remember going out and standing on the deck out there and thinking, okay, I've made some progress yesterday. That's not nothing. I can do it again today. Let me grab some coffee. Let me go down to my office and get to work and just see what happens. And all of a sudden, the rest of these sketches started happening. And I had chords from the Fanfare, and I had some idea of, okay, now I can make some of this work. And I started putting it into Dorico, as I recall. And then I had chords, and I could say with those chords from Dorico, back to the keyboard. Okay, what does this sound like? I've got a G minor 7. I've got an F major. I've got an F suspended 6. I've got an E flat suspended. So something like here, because I'm not actually in E flat, so I don't have an A flat to play with. I've got an E flat 7, no 5, so leaving that 3 out to keep things interesting. Back to an F suspended 7, so here I suppose. Somewhere along the way this moved from F to E flat, which is interesting. That's a pretty significant shift in that everything's down a little lower, and also the tonal effect, different keys feel different, and some of that's where they sit in the kind of tonal space and the timbral space of a given instrument and of different instruments and how they play off of each other. Does it feel very natural for a stringed instrument? Often going to sound very natural in a standard tuning in G or D, because those are open strings and you've got lots of resonance that falls out as a result. Trumpet in B flat, it's going to be really easy to play in B flat. Piano, it's going to be easy to do lots of things, but C is going to play easier than C flat. 7 flats, whee! But there's also a sort of darkness to certain keys and brightness to other keys that I know from talking to other musicians, even if not other composers. D major has a very different sound than D flat major. Why should that be? I don't entirely know. Now, even with questions of temperament, which I'm not going to get into today, even with questions of different resonance, like there's no resonance here, right? You're looking at Complete Control showing me Arturia Piano V2. There's no actual resonance happening there, and they've recorded things or synthesized things when you're dealing with samples. They give you some of that, but not. There's no real resonance happening here. Nonetheless, D and D flat sound different. They feel different. All of those are going to be easy enough for an orchestra to play, but sonically they shift what's possible. They also do affect what's available for instrumentation. Was I conscious of that at this point? No, I was not. I was just mucking around with what sounded right when I was playing it on the piano. Got those chords. We've got what I described as interjections. And again, I was still thinking about this sound of 3, but now they're 16th notes. And once again, we're and all of a sudden we're starting to hear something that's a little closer to where we're going to end up, right? And I'm not playing what I have written down here perfectly because I'm sight reading it almost half a decade later. But you start to see how after a day of mucking with it and then sleeping on it and coming back and trying to put something into Dorico and going back to the piano, as indeed I did, it started to step toward what we'll talk about much more next week, where the work that I ended up with was inspired by those initial opening ideas, but it wasn't the same as those initial opening ideas. And I think this is really common. Back when I was in college, I would get stuck on initial open ideas a lot. I would often not end up making substantial changes. And that's a thing that I had grown some with during and after college, courtesy of feedback from my music professor and courtesy of just thinking about how to get better. But it was really this time, coming back to it for this piece, that I learned not to keep my first idea exactly. Maybe there's a kernel of something good there, but it doesn't have to be exactly this. And to be willing to say, no, to get where I want to go, I'm going to have to revise and revise and revise. And that's a lesson that's stuck with me because I'm working on, in the last 24 hours, I finished a sketch, more than a sketch, a full orchestration of a significant part of a large orchestral work. And what I'm going to do next for most of the rest of this month is revise and edit and say, this part doesn't quite work right, and that part doesn't quite work right. So how do I make them work right together? And how do I smooth out the things that are the result of, I started this literally 3 years ago, and the things it does are fine, but they don't quite fit with things I wrote 3 months ago or 3 days ago. How do I make them integrate? But a lot of my ability to do that now grew out of working on this piece and starting, and you can, those things we heard just now, the difference between day 1 and day 2, and also the endurance to be able to say, I can do this. I only have this week, but if I sit down and keep plugging away at it, I will actually get there. Discouragement of that first day notwithstanding. All right. I think that's enough for one day. It's all I have time to record and edit for sure. I will hopefully be back in July. I'm not going to promise to do any of these more often than that. Continuing to talk about how Fanfare for a New Era of American Spaceflight got to your ears. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Do share this with a friend if you found it fun or interesting in any way, and I'll keep working on making them better. Thanks.